Hello, my friends, and welcome to another episode of Unlimited. Today, we are talking about how to prioritize your needs beyond Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And the reason we're talking about this is partly because it's been coming up a lot recently. I've had several clients reference it. I've had colleagues reference it. I've had it come up in casual conversation with friends and acquaintances. It seems to be really popping up a lot. And I don't know if it's just me or if it's something that is being thought about or explored or whatever, but it's mostly been in reference to it as an explanation for things. And here's the issue. It's not a great explanation of things. It is one man's conceptualization or philosophication or whatever about why people behave the way they do and what motivates them. And it is rooted in certain societal norms that really are problematic. Now, within those norms, it has had a beneficial impact in a lot of ways, and I will talk a little bit about that. And it still has an issue. It has some problematic roots, though if you look at the origins of it, there's another form of understanding ourselves and another way of engaging and being and learning how to be better humans and to care for ourselves and each other that kind of gets obscured by the individualized approach of this hierarchy of needs. So I really wanted to talk about that because it's been coming up, but also because it's in relation to prioritization of needs. So I've had clients bring this forward, as I mentioned, in relationship to why they want to prioritize certain needs or justifying why they are prioritizing certain needs and desires. If it's helpful, sometimes okay. And you are allowed to prioritize certain things because that is what fits for you. So I want to make sure that I'm giving you some practical application, not just philosophication or whatever that word is. Some practical application to take away to support you in your own process. I'm going to share some of the things that I use when I'm working with clients that tie into a different way of thinking about ourselves and our relationship to our needs. And hopefully you can find that helpful in your own life. Of course, if you want some professional support, you can grab a spot in my calendar and schedule a free exploration session to see if I'm a good fit for your needs. So what we're going to talk about in this episode includes understanding Maslow's hierarchy of needs, neuroscience of belonging, decolonizing self-actualization, and discerning your priorities. It's going to be a good time, and I would love to hear your input, your thoughts, your own philosophication. I don't even know what word I'm making up there, but it's kind of hard to say. So anyway, I would love to hear from you. If you have thoughts about this episode, please feel free to email me, send me a message in my DMs. I love to hear from you. And now, without further ado, let's get started. Hey there, I'm Valerie Friedlander, Certified Life Business Alignment Coach, and this is Unlimited. This podcast bridges the individual and the societal, scientific and spiritual, positive and negative, nerdy and no, there's just a lot of nerdy. Come on board and let's unlock a life that's as badass as you are. So let's start with Abraham Maslow, who was born in 1908. He was a humanistic psychologist and philosopher interested in how we fulfill potential versus what goes wrong with people. So there's a lot of things in here that definitely resonate with me, and the approach that I like to take is you're not broken, and there's something missing. There's something you want to do, someplace you want to go. There's a reason why you're struggling. Let's understand this process. Let's move you forward. So anyway, he argued that the primary goal of psychotherapy should be the integration of the self. He was influenced by existentialist philosophers and literary figures, and he was part of the humanistic psychology movement, which is a movement in psychology supporting the belief that humans as individuals are unique, thinking, feeling beings and should be recognized and treated as such by psychologists. I couldn't agree more with that. So what he is most known for is developing this hierarchy of needs, which is a motivational theory in psychology comprised of a 5-tier model of human needs. You may be familiar with it because it is extremely popular. As I mentioned, it comes up a lot. And interestingly enough, I think when it comes up, it's mostly in relation to needs, not necessarily understanding the dynamics of what those needs are. That said, I don't really know that you need to, but we're gonna anyway, because I think it's useful to know what we're talking about. So most of the time when people are thinking of it, they are breaking it down into the 2 forms of needs that Maslow had identified. It's the deficiency needs and the growth needs. The theory is that the deficiency needs motivate people when they are unmet and become stronger the longer they are unmet. And they have to be more or less met for us to become habitually directed toward meeting the next set of needs, which are the growth needs. The growth needs motivate people to grow as a person, and they become stronger the more they're engaged. So the hierarchy, those 5 parts, which actually he did later add a 6th part, which I'll mention as well, but those 5 parts are the basic physiological needs that a lot of people tend to think of right off the bat. Air, water, food, shelter, sleep, clothing, reproduction, those sorts of things. The next one is safety, security needs, personal security, employment, resources, health, property. The next one is affiliation, belongingness, social needs. So that's friendship, intimacy, family, sense of connection. The 4th one is esteem needs. So there are 2 parts to that. One is esteem needs of the self, dignity, a sense of achievement, mastery, independence, and then social esteem needs. So that's recognition, reputation, status, prestige, those sorts of things. And then at the top of the original pyramid is self-actualization. So this is the desire to become the most that one can be, to achieve one's potential, to be expressive and creative, access that creativity, creative thinking, all that. Now, Maslow did not actually believe that many could achieve true actualization and that it wasn't something that you sustained. It was kind of measured in these moments, these experience moments of achieving it. He said only 2% would achieve it. And he didn't think of it as a perfect state, like I have achieved, I have arrived. It was more of a continual process of becoming. So those 2 things kind of are a little weird to me, but for a variety of reasons. I do like the whole understanding of it's not about perfection, it's about process. Though I'm not really sure how you can have only a few people actually achieve a process, but I think that's kind of baked into the model and fits also with this hierarchical structure of achievement and a lot of the white supremacist patriarchal values that are very prevalent during this time of thought in psychology and in the world that Maslow's occupying and the culture that Maslow's occupying. He did add a 6, which is transcendence. So this idea of values that transcend beyond the personal self, which is service to others, pursuit of science, dedication to religion, those sorts of things. So that's the basic model. And this is what a lot of people are pulling on for various ideas, both as they relate to the individual and our self-understanding, but also as it relates within companies and work. So I found one image as I was searching to kind of explore in my initial research of the idea of this pyramid and individual examples being the basic physiological needs, hunger and safety is stability of income, belongingness is friendship, esteem is status, and then self-actualization is self-fulfillment. And then organizational examples being basic salary, pension plan, cordial relation with colleagues, job title, achievement of goals. I found some other ones that were really concerning related to understanding employee engagement, the basic one being that survival needs. So they have it survival, security, belonging, importance, and then self-actualization. And under survival, they have like a disengaged employee. I'm here for the money. I'm leaving when I can. I'm not satisfied with the job I do. My work doesn't excite me. I'm a clock watcher. And then security being not engaged. I'm not interested in overtime. Okay, so here's where I had to stop because I got to tell you, as I was initiating this research, I was having a visceral reaction to these concepts, partly because of the research I've already done. I've done a few episodes on this, one where I specifically engage Maslow when it comes to motivation and what's wrong with my motivation, and just talking about that concept around how we think about ourselves and the over-individualization, and then, of course, more recently talking about work and life and those sorts of things. And I'm like, as soon as I got to that, like, who's interested in overtime? Like, this ties into that thought that if you love your job, you're not going to set healthy boundaries. So like a lot of things that can be simplified and especially oversimplified, while it can be helpful in its simple form to engage, it can be really easily used in a harmful way, this being the example. And I'm not going to go any further into this particular graph that I found because it's not important for what we're talking about. I just wanted to highlight the fact that there's a lot of issues and there are a lot of problematic ways that this is being applied. And I think it lends itself to that. When we take something as important as being human and we create an oversimplified model for understanding ourselves, well, it has been useful in some ways to help people function better in this society. This society is so full of harmful ways of being. Is that really helpful? And that's the question I keep coming across. And I put it to you, like, I would love to hear your thoughts on this because there are so many things like personality assessments that oversimplify people. They put them into some variation of 4 areas and create this idea of who you are. And so while Maslow is coming from this humanistic concept, is it really supportive to understand people as full human beings when we extricate the societal context that's influencing the very model and way of understanding that we're using? Anyway, that's like a really big question, but it hits me in a very strong vibration is the only way I can describe it. Like, part of me feels like it's kind of shaking when I'm talking about this. And I think I kind of imagine it as being this like push and this fight response almost to what we're talking about. So anyway, I just want to call that forward and invite you to share with me your thoughts. And if you've had an interaction or a reaction to this model or another model that you felt kind of oversimplified your life and your experience and your understanding of other people or their understanding of you. I think that happens a lot in corporate spaces. So anyway, please share. I would love to hear. So from that model, decades later in like 1987, so like toward the end of his life, Maslow did propose that the order might not be as rigid as he may have implied in his earlier description, and that some things are more important than others for some people than other people, and behavior may be determined by several or all of the basic needs simultaneously. So maybe it's not as delineated as he originally described. Okay. So there's also evidence for that, and more scientific evidence than Maslow used to create this hierarchy, which I am going to touch on in a moment. So there's an article that I read called Managing with the Brain in Mind. Neuroscience research is revealing the social nature of the high-performance workplace. So this article engages a study that was done to see when people felt excluded what happened. Naomi Eisenberger, a leading social neuroscience researcher at the University of California at Los Angeles, said, "We saw activity in the dorsal portion of the anterior cingulate cortex, the neural region involved in the distressing component of pain, or what is sometimes referred to as the suffering component of pain. Those people who felt the most rejected or excluded had the highest levels of activity in this region. So, in other words, the feeling of being excluded provoked the same sort of reaction in the brain that physical pain might cause. One of her fellow researchers, Matthew Lieberman, also of UCLA, hypothesized that human beings evolved this link between social connection and physical discomfort within the brain, quote, because to a mammal, being socially connected to caregivers is necessary for survival. This study and many others are now emerging that have made something very clear, and that is that the human brain is a social organ that is profoundly impacted in terms of what highlights and what develops by social interaction. So another quote by Lieberman is that most processes operating in the background when your brain is at rest involve thinking about other people and yourself. So any place where you have a social system, like a workplace, isn't just going to be transactional. It's not just those like basic needs of money and welfare, support, health, health insurance, all of that sort of stuff. It's social, which is another very core basic need. We could stop there, but I do think it's important to note some other pieces in this article, and I have this article linked in the show notes if you want to read it, because there's a lot more in there. But the reason I bring this forward is they actually reference Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So I'm going to share this other section that says, one critical thread of research on the social brain starts with the threat and reward response, which is a neurological mechanism that governs a great deal of human behavior. So when something new comes in, the limbic system, which is a relatively primitive part of the brain that most animals have, becomes aroused, and it's on alert to determine if there is a danger here. Neuroscientist Evan Gordon refers to this as the minimize danger, maximize reward response, which is a fundamental organizing principle of the brain. So the neurons are activated, hormones are released as you prepare and look to learn whether whatever this new thing is represents a potential reward or a potential danger. If the perception is danger, and that perception, as I've talked about before, is based in everything in your life up until now, all the interactions, all the experiences that you've had, the levels of cortisol that you are prone to, potentially even given what you experienced in the womb. There's a great book that kind of digs into this. It's very long, but it's very good, by Gabor Mate, about the myth of normal, and talks a lot about the cortisol levels and the dynamics of our society and how we react and respond. So anyway, I recommend that. It'll also be in the show notes. But based on all of those things, if the perception is danger, then the response becomes pure threat response, which is also known as the fight or flight response, the avoid response, and in its extreme form, the amygdala hijack. That's named for a part of the limbic system that can be aroused rapidly and in an emotionally overwhelming way. This is not part of the conscious frontal cortex brain. This is all limbic system. This is all automatic firing of hormones that prepare you to deal with danger. So very important for survival, not exactly helpful for a lot of other things. And again, with the perception, maybe the perception is flawed in terms of the present situation versus, all of the learned experiences and the lived experiences that have led to that perception, which are totally understandable, and those two things can exist at the same time. The learned, lived experience that triggers the survival mode response and the present moment. And that discernment can be very tricky, especially when we're talking about systemic issues. Going back to how this relates to Maslow, Lieberman notes that Maslow's hierarchy of needs theory may have been wrong in this respect of the social needs happening kind of in the middle of that hierarchy, because researchers have documented that this threat response is often triggered in social situations, and it tends to be more intense and longer lasting than the reward response. And as you recall, this threat response and the rejection, especially related to the belonging, hit the pain part of the brain, which is very much wired to our survival. So this doesn't really work with the idea of belonging and social needs happening in the middle of a hierarchy of needs. So social needs also equal survival just as much as those physical needs, according to this research. I also like to note, as I've mentioned before, the frontal cortex burns the most amount of energy in the brain. So like that decision-making process burns a lot of energy. But this threat survival response also burns a lot of energy. It uses up oxygen and glucose from the blood, diverting them from other parts of the brain, including working memory function, which processes new information and ideas, impairing analytic thinking, creative insight, and problem solving. I see this sort of thing come up a lot with clients as we're looking at, okay, well, why do I keep people pleasing? I'm in this stressful situation and then I just do whatever somebody else says instead of standing up for myself. And I want to stand up for myself. Why do I keep not standing up for myself? Avoidance of situations and spinning in stress response just off by yourself, avoiding the potential danger. And then, of course, there's also the fight response, which creates that antagonistic relationship where somebody has to be wrong for you to be okay because they're dangerous or perceived as such. Again, if they actually are dangerous, especially physically dangerous, but even emotionally dangerous, that response is helpful. It doesn't necessarily allow you to find creative solutions and stay out of the dynamics. It tends to replay dynamics. One tool that is rather straightforward, though I would not say it was easy or even necessarily simple to implement, is pausing. It is one of the tools that I use the most. So this is a little bit different from the actual prioritization of your needs, but what it does do is create room for that prioritization to happen. So it's one of the first things that I will invite clients to work on when we're running into that is, sometimes it's writing down what your needs are ahead of time so that when that response kicks in, because if it's programmed to kick in, it will, in certain situations, like this is an uncomfortable conversation and I'm going to shut down. So give yourself room for that automatic process to happen because it's going to happen. Give room for that to happen and then be able to release that energy and make more active decisions in relation. So that takes pausing. That takes stepping back when it's not something you've been able to prepare for. If it is something you've been able to prepare for, then sometimes having something written down you can refer to and go, okay, this is what I wrote when I was more clear-headed, and I'm going to trust myself to go forward with this. I had a client recently have a really positive, very productive, helpful interaction with someone they work with because we did that work of really assessing, okay, what is important here? And here we wrote it down so we can stay focused and centered on that, knowing that, okay, we're going to give some space for decision-making, but we need to get clear on what this is. So that went really well. So those are two tools. Writing something down ahead of time when you are in a clear mind, knowing that this process tends to happen in certain situations. You tend to have that trigger happen. And then also giving yourself room for pausing to recenter, to allow those hormones and all that stuff that's happening automatically to move through you, rather than feeding it and replaying dynamics that you've already decided aren't actually serving you and you don't want. So now that we've identified, okay, here's what's going on with this hierarchy. Okay, it can be sort of helpful in its simplicity, but in its simplicity, it can also be unhelpful. And I mentioned that there's some origins that are rather problematic. So one piece of that is that the method of study that Maslow used was extremely subjective. He used a biographical analysis, which is already prone to bias. plus a very biased sample study to kind of flesh out this idea of what self-actualization looked like, being that all his quote-unquote self-actualized examples were white men. I know you're probably not surprised, but there it is. So I wonder with this sort of thing, as I mentioned before, can you create a benefit from, like a real benefit, like a benefit that has sustainable long-term impact to improve our experience of life as individuals and as a society? Can you create that from an inherently flawed concept? And my inclination is no. While I think you can build some staircases, right? You can build stair steps to beneficial things. If the wood that you use to build the staircase is rotten, eventually the staircase is going to crumble. It's going to fall apart. So that's kind of what I see with this idea of the hierarchy of needs from Maslow. Now, the origins of his hierarchy, based on a study that Ryan Heavy Head, also known as Ryan Firstiver, and the late Narcissi Blood, who were members of the Blackfoot Nation and received a grant from the Canadian government's Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council to research Blackfoot influences on Maslow's hierarchy of needs, found that there is influence. Maslow spent 6 weeks living at the Siksika, the name of the people, their language, and the Blackfoot Reserve in the summer of 1938. He came there with certain hypotheses that were upended and may very well have shaped his theories related to this hierarchy of needs. Now, most articles that I found talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs do not reference this origin. Does that mean that it didn't exist? Or does that mean that we just don't pay attention to it, as so often is the case? I'm going to go with the latter. So often, and I mentioned this in my episode about work-life balance and all the people talking about work-life balance and how much they don't mention the theories and concepts and discussion of work-life balance, excluding people of the global majority, particularly Black people in the United States. They were focused on white people and especially white women moving into the workforce. So often, this is the case when we're talking about older psychological, philosophical, even medical theories about people. According to the research that was done by Ryan Heavy Head and Narcissi Blood, the 30-year-old Maslow, along with 2 others, arrived at Siksika intending to test the universality of Maslow's theory that social hierarchies are maintained by dominance of some people over others. Okay, so here we are. We're coming in with this hierarchy notion, very much originated in Maslow's white male society. However, he didn't see the quest for dominance in Blackfoot society. Instead, he discovered astounding levels of cooperation, minimal inequality, restorative justice, full bellies, and high levels of life satisfaction. He estimated that 80 to 90% of the Blackfoot tribe had a quality of self-esteem that was only found in about 5 to 10% of his own population. That's a quote. Ryan Heavy Head also shared that Maslow saw a place where what he would later call self-actualization was the norm, and where wealth was measured not in amount of possessions and money, but in generosity. The wealthier you were, the more you had to give away. People who broke laws weren't labeled as deviant, and they were redeemed if they left the behavior behind. Children were treated as equal members of society versus the strict disciplinary approach from his own culture. So Maslow came in and he's asking this first question about, is this universally true that we need some people to dominate other people? Okay, the answer is no. Now, the next question is, how do we become self-actualized? And as someone whose work is fundamentally based in questions, I understand and really have a lot of value around the quality of a question and what you ask. What you ask matters because it influences what you get back and what you understand. This question is fundamentally flawed, in my opinion. So many First Nation communities wouldn't use the term self-actualized, but one of the things this article says is that while they wouldn't use the same word, they might be more likely to say that we are born that way. We are born self-actualized. So our natural state is self-actualized. And this reminds me of a quote that became more recently popular by its use by the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but was originally made by Sarah Moore Grimke, who was a 19th century abolitionist and women's rights activist, who said, "I ask no favors for my sex. I surrender not our claim to equality. All I ask of our brethren is that they will take their feet from off our necks and permit us to stand upright on the ground which God designed us to occupy." So, what I would ask as I think about that quote, and I think about that question of self-actualization, because we are struggling with basic needs. We are struggling with a lot of those pieces. And as I've said before, we don't exist outside of a societal context. So in some ways, Maslow's hierarchy makes sense given the societal context that we exist in. And yet, can we imagine something different? Maybe the question needs to be more along the lines of, how do we remove the barriers to accessing our self-actualized being? How do we remove the barriers to our inherent self-actualization? That idea of constantly becoming and achieving and connection to oneself. Now, the article about Maslow's hierarchy relationship to the Blackfoot tribe does provide a First Nations perspective on this hierarchy, which is at the foot of this pyramid is self-actualization, and then community actualization, and then cultural perpetuity. So it's this idea that when we are connected to our actualized self, we can then feed into community actualization, which then feeds into cultural perpetuity, which really doesn't naturally feed into a pyramid structure. It's more of concentric circles because they feed each other. They relate to each other. When we're self-actualized and we can feed into the community, then we feed into cultural perpetuity, which feeds into the next generation's access to their own self-actualization instead of all of these ways that we've buried ourselves in our access to that actualized self, right? All the feet on our necks, the ways of being in the world that we have created that block us and fit us into this pyramid idea of hierarchies and needs instead of honoring the wholeness of ourselves and supporting that through our community and through our generations. We've actually removed that more and more. And that's another reason why I really like the book, The Myth of Normal, that I mentioned before, because it talks about these cycles and all of these ways of being that we block even just into our neurobiology and how we understand ourselves and our reactions and our trauma responses to survive in a world that is forcing us to be counter to the way we naturally are, which even at its very root is that over-individualized self, that self divorced from community, which I would also argue this idea of hierarchy of needs emphasizes because it's very much focused on individual needs with a goal that is also very individual, self-actualization. I do think it's important to note that there's great diversity among First Nations, and the Blackfoot didn't have a model for their worldview that was neatly codified like Maslow did his hierarchy of needs, which is another thing. A lot of the things that we know and are familiar with are because people wrote it down, and that doesn't always mean that it is the most beneficial or accurate. It just means somebody wrote it down first. But I do want to note that, as that article states, this concept of self-actualization, community actualization, cultural perpetuity was created by Dr. Cindy Blackstock, herself a member of the Gitxsan tribe, who interviewed members of the Blackfoot Nation and created the illustration that you see in the article. Another book that I started reading, there's a quote in it that this kind of makes me think of when it comes to this idea that we have so many things that are blocking us from ourselves, from understanding ourselves. And it's not that we don't need all of these needs met that are listed. It's more that if we were allowed access to ourselves, if we had the space where we could think creatively, where we honored our self-actualizedness, where we didn't put all these things, all these traumas, all these ways of being and fitting ourselves into these boxes that we're expected to, and these hierarchies of societal norms, what we could accomplish. And the quote is from the book, In Defense of Witches, The Legacy of the Witch Hunts and Why Women Are Still on Trial by Mona Chollet. And the quote says, "Capitalism is always engaged in selling back to us in product form all that it has first destroyed." And this is where I think of how so many aspects of our society are working toward destroying our sense of self and our trust in ourselves and our connection to our intuition and our sense of even being able to be actualized, like even just suggesting that only 2% of people could actually become actualized. Like, I think that's ridiculous. Whether it's true or whether it is untrue, just the idea that there's so much in the way of that happening or being accessible is a huge issue. So what do we do about it? Well, this is why I approach the idea of prioritization of your needs the way that I do. And it starts with those tools that I mentioned before, which is that checking in, giving yourself space to check in and hear yourself beyond the triggered response. So allowing more room, not being in so much hustle and stress. And I think in some ways, having that coaching relationship helps with that because there's dedicated space to that processing and to hearing the information that that trigger is providing while also not allowing it to dominate the choices that you make. So we hear the information and then we make decisions based off of that as well as what you really want. So we're finding that balance between living in the world as it is and creating something different. And that takes slowing down, which is certainly not supported in our current societal structure and economic structure, which is one of the reasons why it is so difficult to do. And one of the reasons why space is needed for that. And it's one way that my industry feeds right into that quote of selling back to us in product form what capitalism has first destroyed. Because I think this is something that we should naturally have. My goal being to put myself out of a job. So taking that space to listen and know what you want and not try and fit it into any kind of box, but really sense, okay, what is necessary? What is needed? What do I want? What's the next step? And like one client recently was saying, well, I thought that we were supposed to focus on this job thing, but I really think I need to focus on housing and, Maslow and all that. And I was like, well, hold up. It's okay to choose to focus on the house stuff. Like, what are the needs here? Is that space available to focus? And for her, she's like, yeah, I'm really glad I do have the privilege of being able to focus on this. Great. You don't need to justify that. This is what works for her brain. She's neurodivergent, and being able to focus on one thing and really dig into that, be able to hyper-focus and get as much done as she can there makes sense for the way her brain works. Not to say that that's true for all neurodivergent people, but for her, that makes sense. So being able to sense, okay, where am I at? What is the world like right now? And what do I need to do to support myself moving one step toward what I want? Instead of making it about you and something wrong with you and something's broken about you and, well, this is just the way I am and all of those sorts of things. It's basically, while we can't remove just by noticing it, the foot of society on our necks in the various ways that takes shape and the various levels that impact us, we can't do that in one decision. But what we can do is recognize that it's not our brokenness that is causing the experience that we're having, and to be able to say, what is it that I need right now? And honor that humanness, that human experience of living in a society that is what it is right now. And really being able to do that allows access to making clearer decisions that allow you to then prioritize what is the next indicated thing in this space. So I know that seems really vague. Like as I say it, I'm like, can you be more vague? But here's the thing. It's complicated, and it really depends on you and your situation and the lived experiences that you have had. And it's not something that can be prescriptive. It's not something that can be neatly put into a little graphic. There's a process to it. And this is, I guess, kind of back to that self-actualization of it's a process of becoming, regardless of what level of need, or I don't even want to say level of need, regardless of what aspect of needs are present. It's being able to check in and know what is important for you to be able to move forward the way you want to move forward, and meeting yourself where you're at and knowing that that's okay. And it's not your fault, and it's not because something's wrong with you. It's just honoring what your experience is, both in the past and in the present, and what you want to create for the future, both for yourself and the people that you impact. And that's complicated. Sorry. I wish it was cleaner cut in some ways, but I think, again, it would be problematic to try and make it so. So hopefully some of those tools of checking in, giving yourself space, writing it down if you know you're going to get triggered in your application of it, having communal support, having people around you to support you, not necessarily for that traditional accountability, but for like checking in and going, okay, what worked? What didn't? What got in your way? What can we do to move you forward? Was there another need that really needed to take priority here? Not based off of some guy's hierarchy pyramid thing, but based off of you and your knowledge of yourself and your knowledge of your life and your circumstances, because you are the expert of your life. And you deserve to honor that. I would love to hear what thoughts have come up for you while listening to this episode. It's certainly longer than I intended it to be, but there you go. That's what it is. So if you feel so inclined to share with me, I'd love to hear from you. Again, you can send me an email. You can send me a message on social media. And if you are looking for support, grab a spot on my calendar and let's chat. Or if you know somebody who is, have them grab a spot on my calendar. There is no pressure at all in these calls. It is really helping you discern what is most supportive for you, whether that's working with me, whether that's a resource I have or I know of, whether it's another coach that I could refer you to. Really, my goal is that you get what you need to be able to move forward so that we can start actualizing our community because we have more access to ourselves, and creating new generational patterns that are healthier and more supportive, both for us as well as for our ecosystem. And with that, I will talk to you all next time. Thanks for listening. I so appreciate you being here. If you got something out of today's episode, please share it. Leave me a review, take a screenshot, and post it on social with a shout out to me. Send it to a friend or, all of the above. Want to hang out more? Join me on Instagram. Or better yet, get on my mailing list to make sure you don't miss out on anything. And remember, your possibilities are as unlimited as you are. Allow yourself to shine, my friend. The world needs your light. See you next time.